AZ-305, Designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solutions 50 Questions and Answers. You have an Azure solution that uses the Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB API. You need to ensure that you can restore data in the solution to any point in time from the last 30 days by using a self-service solution. Which backup solution should you use? Option 1, Azure Backup. Option 2, Azure Cosmos DB Continuous Backup. Option 3, Microsoft Azure Recovery Services, MARS. Option 4, Azure Cosmos DB Periodic Backup. Correct answer, Azure Cosmos DB Continuous Backup. Explanation: Continuous Backup Mode in Azure Cosmos DB provides self-service restore for any point in time from the last 30 days. Periodic Backup Mode in Azure Cosmos DB enforces a minimum backup time of an hour, not any point in time, and requires a support ticket for restore. Azure Backup and MARS does not support Azure Cosmos DB Backup. You have an on-premises data center that connects to Azure by using ExpressRoute. The on-premises data center uses Microsoft System Center Data Protection Manager, DPM, for backup and restore of on-premises Windows virtual machines. You need to ensure that backups from the on-premises virtual machines are copied to Azure. The solution must use the minimum amount of administrative effort. What should you recommend? Option 1, deploy a DPM server in Azure. Option 2, deploy Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS, to the on-premises network. Option 3, install the Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS, agent on the DPM server. Option 4, replace DPM with Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS. Correct answer, install the Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS, agent on the DPM server. Explanation: Installing the MARS agent on the DPM server allows the backups to be copied to Recovery Services vaults in Azure. Replacing DPM with MABS, deploying a DPM server in Azure, and deploying MABS to the on-premises network all require a lot of change. You have an Azure storage account that contains a file share. You need to recommend a solution to automatically back up the file share. What should you recommend using to store the backups? Option 1, Azure Files in a second Azure region. Option 2, Azure Key Vault. Option 3, Backup Vault. Option 4, Recovery Services Vault. Correct answer, Recovery Services Vault. Explanation: Recovery Service Vaults and Backup Vaults provide protection for data from different data sources. Azure Files is a supported data source for Recovery Service Vaults. You have an Azure subscription that contains Azure SQL databases. You need to recommend a backup solution for the databases. The solution must ensure that the backups are configurable for at least 90 days. What should you recommend? Option 1, GeoZone Redundant Storage, GZRS. Option 2, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS. Option 3, Long-Term Retention, LTR. Option 4, Transaction Log Backups. Correct answer, Long-Term Retention, LTR. Explanation: LTR is required to store a backup for more than 35 days. LRS and GZRS options are valid storage redundancy options. Transaction log backups are not relevant for this scenario. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account named Storage One. The Storage One account stores unstructured data. You need to recommend a backup solution for Storage One. What should you recommend? Option 1, Azure Backup for Blobs. Option 2, Azure Site Recovery. Option 3, Long-Term Retention. Correct answer, Azure Backup for Blobs. Explanation: Azure Backup for Blobs is the correct option to enable a backup vault and a backup policy for blob protection. Azure Site Recovery does not provide backup for blobs. Azure Site Recovery is disaster recovery solution for on-premises workloads. Long-term retention is for Azure SQL databases. You are designing a highly available multi-tenant Azure App Service web app. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the web app is available across zones in a single Azure region. The solution must minimize costs. Which app service plan should you recommend for the web app? Option 1, Dedicated Compute Premium V2 P1 V2. Option 2, Dedicated Compute Premium V3 P1 V3. Option 3, Dedicated Compute Standard S1. Option 4, Shared Compute D1. Correct answer, Dedicated Compute Premium V2 P1 V2. Explanation, only Premium V2 and Premium V3 are zone redundant. P1 V2 has lower costs. You have an Azure deployment used as disaster recovery landing zone for an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server solution. You need to recommend a high availability solution for a SQL Server virtual machine that allows for minimal data loss. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you recommend? Option 1, Always on Failover Cluster Instance, FCI. Option 2, Azure Backup. Option 3, Azure Site Recovery. Option 4, Log Shipping. Correct answer, Log Shipping. Explanation, Log Shipping is the correct answer as it provides an easy-to-deploy and administer high-availability solution based on backup and restore. Distributed Availability Groups require Windows Server Failover Cluster, WSFC, which is not easy to deploy or administer. Azure Backup is not the correct answer, as it is not a high-availability solution. Always on FCI requires that the FCI be implemented, and is, therefore, not easy to deploy and administer. You are designing a web app named App1 that will be deployed to Azure. App1 will depend on an Azure SQL database named DB1. Resources will be deployed to 2 Azure regions. DB1 will have data geo-replicated between both regions. You need to recommend a high availability design for App1 that minimizes downtime. Which approach should you recommend? Option 1, Active/Active. Option 2, Active/Passive with Cold Standby. Option 3, Active/Passive with Hot Standby. Option 4, Backup/Restore. Correct answer, Active/Passive with Hot Standby. Explanation, the fastest option is to have both regions active and ready and to use load balancing. Because DB1 does not support this scenario, an Active/Active solution cannot be used. With Active/Passive, Hot Standby provides the fastest recovery time. Cold Standby provides the lowest cost option. Backup/Restore will not minimize downtime. You are designing an Azure Virtual Machine solution that has a front-end and a back-end, each hosted in its own virtual machine scale set. You need to ensure that the virtual machines from the front-end and back-end communicate by using the lowest latency possible. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Application Security Groups. Option 2, Availability Sets. Option 3, Availability Zones. Option 4, Proximity Placement Groups. Correct answer, Proximity Placement Groups. Explanation, by placing virtual machines in the same proximity group, they are deployed close together for lower latency. Availability sets separate resources on different physical hosts. Availability zones separate virtual machines in different Azure data centers within a zone for availability. Security groups are used for Network Security Group (NSG) rules. You are designing an Azure Virtual Machine solution to host a stateless application. You need to ensure that the number of virtual machines used is increased and decreased automatically based on CPU usage. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Azure API Management. Option 2, Azure App Service. Option 3, a load balancer with a virtual machine scale set. Option 4, a load balancer with virtual machines. Correct answer, a load balancer with a virtual machine scale set. Explanation, a load balancer with a virtual machine scale set allows for autoscaling. A load balancer with virtual machines does not provide autoscaling. Azure App Service and Azure API Management cannot run virtual machines. You have an Azure subscription. You need to configure an Azure Compute solution that meets the following workload requirements. Full control is not required. High Performance Computing, HPC, is required. What should you use? Option 1, Azure Batch. Option 2, Azure Functions. Option 3, Azure Container Instances. Option 4, Azure Virtual Machines. Correct answer, Azure Batch. Explanation: Azure Batch is the correct answer as it provides HPC resources without the complexity of full control. Virtual machines require full control and are not related to any workload requirements in the scenario. Azure Functions does not provide HPC, and neither does Azure Container Instances. You are deploying a web app named Web App 1 using Azure pipelines to the following 3 environments. Development, User Acceptance Testing, UAT, Production. You need to ensure that if an issue is identified in production, you can quickly switch back to the previous version of the code. What should you include in the solution? Option 1, DNS Server. Option 2, Azure Front Door. Option 3, Azure Traffic Manager. Option 4, Deployment Slots. Correct answer, Deployment Slots. Explanation: Deployment slots provided by Azure Web Apps is the fastest method for swapping between deployed environments. Front Door is not as fast. Traffic Manager and a DNS server both depend on DNS name caches and TTL values. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server deployment that you plan to migrate to Azure. The SQL Server code regularly executes operating system commands by using the XP_CON shell statement. Performance metrics for the existing system show the following. Average CPU is 45%. Average disk I/O is 98%. Which deployment option should you recommend for the migrated system? Option 1, Azure SQL Database. Option 2, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option 3, Azure Storage Optimized Virtual Machine. Option 4, Azure Memory Optimized Virtual Machine. Correct answer, Azure Storage Optimized Virtual Machine. Explanation: You need to deploy a virtual machine-based solution for SQL Server as low-level operating system access is required. From the available options, the Storage Optimized Virtual Machine provides the best performance, given the current loadings. You are designing a solution that requires different applications to communicate with other applications by using a polling mechanism. You need to use a fully managed service to handle the messages sent to the applications. What should you include in the solution? Option 1, Apache Kafka on Azure HD Insight. Option 2, Azure Event Grid. Option 3, Azure Event Hubs. Option 4, Azure Service Bus. Correct answer, Azure Service Bus. Explanation: Service Bus uses a publication/subscription method for messages with polling. Event Hubs uses a push mechanism for streaming. Event Grid uses a triggering mechanism for events, push. Kafka on HD Insight is not fully managed. You are designing a large-scale microservices-based application. A message queue will be used to hold unprocessed messages. Each message will be processed once, and then deleted from the queue. Each message will be approximately 32 kilobytes in size. At peak periods, up to 10 million messages might be unprocessed. Which messaging service should you recommend for the application? Option 1, Azure Event Hubs. Option 2, Azure IoT Hub. Option 3, Azure Queue Storage. Option 4, Azure Service Bus. Correct answer, Azure Queue Storage. Explanation: A message queue is needed to meet the processing requirement. The key limitation in this situation is the volume of data. 10,032 kilobytes messages exceeds the 80 gigabytes limit for Service Bus. Your organization manufactures breathing machines to assist patients with asthma. You are creating a Microsoft Power BI dashboard to monitor the overall effectiveness of the machines across all users. Each machine has built-in wireless internet connectivity and can send monitoring data to an online service. Azure Stream Analytics will be used to populate a streaming dataset in Power BI. To which service should the breathing machine send data? Option 1, Azure Cosmos DB. Option 2, Azure Event Hubs. Option 3, Azure SQL Database. Option 4, Azure Stream Analytics. Correct answer, Azure Event Hubs. Explanation: Event Hubs is a good target for large numbers of events from internet-connected devices. It is also a good source of event data for Stream Analytics, which can then be used to populate a streaming dataset in Power BI. You are designing a web app named Web App 1. The headers and footers of the web pages delivered by Web App 1 will contain large amounts of static HTML. You need to recommend a solution to provide the greatest responsiveness for Web App 1. What should you include in the recommendation? Option 1, Azure Cache for Redis. Option 2, Azure Load Balancer. Option 3, Azure Traffic Manager. Option 4, Azure Web App Deployment Slots. Correct answer, Azure Cache for Redis. Explanation: the primary way to improve the responsiveness of Web App 1 is to avoid having it constantly calculating and delivering static content. Azure Cache for Redis is designed to eliminate most of this overhead. Traffic Manager, Deployment Slots, and Azure Load Balancer do not directly address the responsiveness requirement. You are designing a migration solution to move an Oracle WebLogic application from an on-premises data center to Azure. What can you use to host the Oracle WebLogic application in Azure? Option 1, Azure API Management. Option 2, Azure App Service. Option 3, Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Option 4, Azure Service Fabric. Correct answer, Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Explanation: you can host Oracle WebLogic in AKS, but not in Azure App Service, Azure Service Fabric, or Azure API Management. What are solutions for running Oracle WebLogic Server on Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Virtual Machines, Microsoft Learn? You are planning to migrate your organization to Azure. You are considering the migration effort for each workload based on the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. Which 3 phases should you design as part of the migration plan? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Option 1, Assess. Option 2, Deploy. Option 3, Govern. Option 4, Release. Option 5, Test. Correct answer, Assess, Deploy, Release. Explanation: the 3 migration phases for Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure are Assess, Deploy, and Release. You are planning a migration to Azure by using the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. You consider the implementation of innovative new solutions as critical to the outcome of the migration. Which Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure phase covers the implementation of innovative solutions? Option 1, Adopt. Option 2, Govern. Option 3, Plan. Option 4, Ready. Correct answer, Adopt. Explanation: the Adopt phase is comprised of both the migration and innovation stages. You are planning to migrate your organization to Azure. You have many workloads to migrate to the cloud. You are considering tools that can automate the creation of the necessary Azure-based resources. Which 2 tools should you consider? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Option 1, Azure App Configuration. Option 2, Azure Database Migration Service. Option 3, Azure Migrate. Option 4, Azure Spring Apps. Correct answer, Azure Database Migration Service, Azure Migrate. Explanation: Azure Data Migration Service can help with database migration, and Azure Migrate can help by creating the required resources for many services. Azure Spring Apps is a service that relates to building and deploying Spring Boot apps. Azure App Configuration relates to the configuration of applications and the use of feature flags. You need to design a networking solution to optimize connectivity from the Internet to an Azure App Service web app. The solution must meet the following requirements. Cache static objects. Terminate SSL connections as close to the end user as possible. Route traffic to the lowest latency Azure region hosting the web app. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Azure Application Gateway. Option 2, Azure Front Door. Option 3, Azure Load Balancer. Option 4, Azure Traffic Manager. Correct answer, Azure Front Door. Explanation: Front Door provides all these features. Traffic Manager does not provide caching or SSL termination. Application Gateway provides SSL termination, but not close to the end user. Azure Load Balancer will not do any of this. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual network named VNet1. VNet1 contains 2 subnets named Subnet1 and Subnet2. You plan to analyze all the outbound traffic from the subscription by using a third-party solution on a network virtual appliance, NVA. You need to recommend a connectivity solution to route all the outbound traffic. What should you recommend? Option 1, Private Endpoint. Option 2, Service Endpoint. Option 3, User-Defined Route, UDR. Option 4, VPN Gateway. Correct answer, User-Defined Route, UDR. Explanation: UDR is the correct answer, as this Azure service allows you to overwrite Azure default routes and route the traffic to a solution on an NVA. A private endpoint, service endpoint, and VPN gateway are connectivity solutions that do not allow you to route traffic to an NVA. You are planning a security solution for resources in Azure. You need to recommend a solution to filter traffic between the resources in a single virtual network. Which two services should you include in the recommendation? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Option 1, a Network Security Group, NSG. Option 2, a Network Virtual Appliance, NVA. Option 3, Azure Front Door. Option 4, Azure Traffic Manager. Correct answer, a Network Security Group, NSG, a Network Virtual Appliance, NVA. Explanation: you can filter network traffic on a virtual network by using an NSG or by using an NVA. Several NVAs are available in Azure Marketplace. Front Door and Traffic Manager are primarily used to route incoming traffic. You are designing the migration plan for an Amazon RDS database named DB1. You plan to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance. You need to recommend a solution to automate the migration by using PowerShell. The solution must meet the following requirements. Minimize the number of tools to be installed. Minimize downtime. Which migration tool should you recommend? Option 1, Azure Database Migration Service. Option 2, Bulk Copy. Option 3, Import-Export Wizard. Option 4, the Azure SQL Migration Extension for Azure Data Studio. Correct answer, Azure Database Migration Service. Explanation: Azure Database Migration Service can be automated by using PowerShell. The Azure SQL Migration Extension for Azure Data Studio requires installing software and cannot be automated with PowerShell. Bulk Copy and Import-Export Wizard need downtime. You are designing a solution that uses Azure SQL databases. You need to ensure that the database solution meets the following requirements. Has 3 IOPS per DTU. Uses column store indexing. Is optimized for costs. Which service tier should you use? Option 1, Basic. Option 2, Premium. Option 3, Standard S2. Option 4, Standard S3. Correct answer, Standard S3. Explanation: Basic and Standard S2 do not provide column store indexing. Standard S3 provides column store indexing and is cheaper than Premium. You have an Azure App Service web app that writes data to an Azure SQL database. You plan to configure the database to use the Always Encrypted feature. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the web app can write encrypted data. Which two actions should you include in the recommendations? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Option 1, change the connection string used by the application. Option 2, change the SSL settings for the web app. Option 3, enable transparent data encryption, TDE. Option 4, store keys in Azure Key Vault. Option 5, store keys in the certificate store. Correct answer, change the connection string used by the application. Store keys in Azure Key Vault. Explanation: you need to change the connection string to use Always Encrypted and access to the keys from a store such as Key Vault. Changing the SSL settings for the web app allows the use of SSL for in-transit encryption, but not always encrypted. You are developing a new Microsoft SQL Server application that will run in Azure. The application will use the spatial capabilities of SQL Server. You need to recommend a SQL Server deployment option for the application. The solution must minimize ongoing administration costs. What should you recommend? Option 1, Azure SQL Database. Option 2, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option 3, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Correct answer, Azure SQL Database. Explanation: Azure SQL Database supports SQL Server spatial capabilities and minimizes general administrative overhead. SQL Managed Instance has higher administrative overhead than Azure SQL Database and supports spatial capabilities. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine has the highest ongoing administrative overhead. You are designing a data storage solution in Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. Be optimized for unstructured data. Support geo-redundant storage, GRS. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Azure Data Lake Storage. Option 2, Azure SQL Database. Option 3, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option 4, Azure Synapse Analytics. Correct answer, Azure Data Lake Storage. Explanation: Data Lake Storage is optimized for unstructured data and provides GRS. The remaining answers do not meet either requirement. You are designing a data storage solution in Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. Provide read and write region replicas with eventual consistency. Store non-relational data. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Azure Cosmos DB. Option 2, Azure SQL Database. Option 3, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option 4, Azure Synapse Analytics. Correct answer, Azure Cosmos DB. Explanation: Azure Cosmos DB provides read and write replicas with eventual consistency and can store non-relational data. Azure SQL Database, Azure Synapse Analytics, and SQL Managed Instance do not provide read-write replicas across regions with eventual consistency. Your organization operates from locations in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Germany. Each location has employees that work with files stored in a file share on Azure Storage. You are designing the structure of the storage accounts. The accounts must meet the following requirements. A single policy will enforce regulatory requirements. Low I/O latency is critical. Costs must be minimized. How many storage accounts should you create? Option 1, 1. Option 2, 2. Option 3, 3. Option 4, 4. Correct answer, 4. Explanation: the requirement for high performance is best met by local files in each country. A single policy can still be applied at a scope that covers the 4 storage accounts. Increasing the number of storage accounts does not increase the costs of the solution, apart from a very small potential increase in administration costs. You are planning the deployment of an Azure storage account that will host a file share. You need to recommend the storage tier for the account. The solution must provide the lowest possible latency for file access. While storage tier should you recommend? Option 1, Cool. Option 2, Hot. Option 3, Premium. Option 4, Transaction Optimized. Correct answer, Premium. Explanation: Azure Files offers 4 tiers of storage: Premium, Transaction Optimized, Hot, and Cool. The lowest latency is offered by the Premium tier. You need to design a file storage solution in Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. Provide the highest possible durability. Remain available during a zone or Azure region failure. Which type of redundancy should you use? Option 1, Geo-Redundant Storage, GRS. Option 2, Geo-Zone Redundant Storage, GZRS. Option 3, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS. Option 4, Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS. Correct answer, Geo-Zone Redundant Storage, GZRS. Explanation: Geo-Zone Redundant Storage, GZRS, provides zone and region redundancy and the highest durability. Locally Redundant Storage, LRS, provides redundancy at the zone level. Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS, provides redundancy at the region level. Geo-Redundant Storage, GRS, provides redundancy for region failure, but not at the zone and region level. You are designing the redundancy requirements for files stored in Azure storage accounts. You plan to store files that can be easily recreated. You need to minimize storage cost. Which type of redundancy should you include in the design? Option 1, Geo-Redundant Storage, GRS. Option 2, Geo-Zone Redundant Storage, GZRS. Option 3, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS. Option 4, Read Access Geo-Zone Redundant Storage, RAGZRS. Correct answer, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS. Explanation: LRS provides the least redundancy of all the options. It is best used for files that can easily be reconstructed. RAGZRS, GZRS, and GRS are not required and are more expensive. You need to recommend a protection strategy for files stored in an Azure storage account. The solution must meet the following requirements. Protection must last for 5 years. During the retention period, new objects can be created. During the retention period, files must not be deleted or modified. After the retention period, files can be deleted, but they cannot be modified. What should you recommend using to apply the protection? Option 1, a legal hold policy. Option 2, a delete lock. Option 3, a time-based retention policy. Option 4, a read-only lock. Correct answer, a time-based retention policy. Explanation: during the retention period of a time-based retention policy, files can be created and read, but they cannot be modified or deleted. When the retention period expires, files can be deleted but not modified. This meets the requirements. Your organization has many Microsoft SQL Server Integration Services, SSAS, packages that run on an on-premises SQL Server. You are migrating the SQL Server resources to Azure. You need to migrate the SSIS packages to Azure. Which two options you can use? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Option 1, Azure Data Factory. Option 2, Azure SQL Database. Option 3, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option 4, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Correct answer, Azure Data Factory, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Explanation: when you deploy SQL Server to an Azure virtual machine, you can install SSIS and run the packages natively. You can also deploy an SSIS integration runtime to Data Factory to execute the SSIS packages. The other options do not support SSIS. You need to design a data analysis solution in Azure that meets the following requirements. Allows for data transformation. Links data to Microsoft Power BI. Performs near real-time log analysis. What should you use? Option 1, Azure Cosmos DB. Option 2, Azure Data Factory. Option 3, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option 4, Azure Synapse Analytics. Correct answer, Azure Synapse Analytics. Explanation: Azure Synapse Analytics allows you to transform data, links data to Power BI, and performs near real-time log analysis. You cannot do near real-time log analysis in Data Factory. You cannot perform near real-time analysis in Azure Cosmos DB or SQL Managed Instance. You have an Azure App Service app named App1. You need to identify the App1 features that are most popular with users and how users interact with App1. Which Azure Monitor Insight should you use? Option 1, Azure Activity Log Insights. Option 2, Azure Container Insights. Option 3, Azure Data Explorer Clusters Insights. Option 4, Azure Monitor Application Insights. Correct answer, Azure Monitor Application Insights. Explanation: Azure Monitor Application Insights is an extensible application performance management service that monitors the availability, performance, and usage of your web application. Azure Container Insights monitors the performance of container workloads that are deployed to managed Kubernetes clusters hosted on Azure Kubernetes Service. Azure Activity Log Insights. Azure Data Explorer Insights provides comprehensive monitoring of your clusters. You have 5 Azure SQL databases in a resource group named RG1. You have a log analytics workspace named WS1. WS1 is configured to use Resource Context Access Mode. Databases in RG1 are configured to use WS1 for diagnostic logs. A user named User1 needs to be able to review the logs for the databases in RG1. Which role will you assign User1? The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. Option 1, contributor role for RG1. Option 2, contributor role for WS1. Option 3, reader role for RG1. Option 4, reader role for WS1. Correct answer, reader role for RG1. Explanation: in resource context reviews, read access to the resource, or group of resources, provides the required permissions. Granting contributor role to WS1 or RG1 provides far too many permissions for the user. Reader role to WS1 provides access to other resources that report to the workspace. You are designing a solution that uses Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. You need to ensure that a user has permissions to view and modify AKS roles within an AKS cluster. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. Which built-in role should you assign to the user? Option 1, Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster Admin role. Option 2, Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster User role. Option 3, Azure Kubernetes Service Contributor role. Option 4, Azure Kubernetes Service RBAC Writer. Correct answer, Azure Kubernetes Service Contributor role. Explanation: contributors can change roles and bindings. The Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster Admin role provides permissions to list cluster admin credential actions only. The Azure Kubernetes Service RBAC Writer role cannot modify roles and role bindings. The Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster User role can only list user credential access. You have an on-premises Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS, domain. You deploy a new Microsoft Entra tenant. You need to recommend a solution to sync changes to users between the two directories. What should you recommend include in the recommendation? Option 1, a Windows Server VM with the Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS, role installed. Option 2, Microsoft Entra B2B. Option 3, Microsoft Entra Connect. Option 4, Azure Data Sync. Correct answer, Microsoft Entra Connect. Explanation: Microsoft Entra Connect is designed to sync users and devices between Microsoft Entra ID-based domains and ADDS domains. Azure Data Sync is for syncing data, not directories. Microsoft Entra B2B is a mode of operation for Microsoft Entra ID that enables external identities from other Microsoft Entra ID-based domains. DIRSync is now deprecated and should no longer be used. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to implement an Azure Key Vault. The solution must meet the following requirements. Prevent the accidental deletion of keys, secrets, and certificates. Prevent the deletion of the key vault, keys, secrets, and certificates in a configurable retention period. Which two key vault features should you use to meet the requirements? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Option 1, Access Policies. Option 2, Key Vault Firewall. Option 3, Key Vault Premium Tier. Option 4, Purge Protection. Option 5, Soft Delete. Correct answer, Purge Protection, Soft Delete. Explanation: Soft Delete is a correct answer as it's designed to prevent the accidental deletion of your key vault and keys, secrets, and certificates stored inside a key vault. Purge Protection is a correct answer since it works as a recycle bin, designed to prevent the deletion of your key vault, keys, secrets, and certificates by a malicious insider. Access policies control access but do not prevent resource deletion or prevent recover. The same goes for Key Vault Firewall. Key Vault Premium Tier implements HSM keys and does not prevent deletions. You have an Azure subscription that contains a web app named WebApp1. You need to recommend a solution to allow or deny access to WebApp1 only for users signed in from compliant tablet devices. What should you use? Option 1, Conditional Access. Option 2, Microsoft Entra ID Protection. Option 3, Microsoft Entra Connect. Option 4, Microsoft Entra Verified ID. Correct answer, Conditional Access. Explanation: Conditional access is the correct option since it is a tool that Microsoft Entra uses to allow or deny access to resources by using policies to know from which device the user is requesting access. Microsoft Entra ID protection is based on a signal for identity-based risks but does not detect devices being used by a user. Microsoft Entra Connect syncs identities from on-premises Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS. Microsoft Entra Verified ID previously implements decentralized ID management. You have an application that runs on load-balanced Azure virtual machines. The application must access an Azure storage account and an Azure Key Vault. You need to recommend an identity strategy for accessing Azure resources. The solution must meet the following requirements. Secure access to the resources based on permissions. Minimize the number of identities to create. Which type of identity should you include in the recommendation? Option 1, Microsoft Entra ID groups. Option 2, Microsoft Entra ID users. Option 3, System-assigned managed identities. Option 4, User-assigned managed identities. Correct answer, User-assigned managed identities. Explanation: you create a single managed identity and assign it to virtual machines and permissions. Using system-assigned managed identities, create one identity for each virtual machine, and those identities must be added to permissions for each resource accessed by the virtual machines. Microsoft Entra ID users and groups requires creating the users and the group manually. You need to design an identity solution for Azure virtual machines. The solution must meet with the following requirements. Identities must be removed when virtual machines are deleted. Identities cannot be shared among multiple virtual machines. Which type of identity should you use? Option 1, Microsoft Entra Groups. Option 2, Microsoft Entra Users. Option 3, System-assigned managed identities. Option 4, User-assigned managed identities. Correct answer, System-assigned managed identities. Explanation: using system-assigned managed identities will create one identity for each virtual machine and delete the identity when the resource is deleted. User-assigned managed identities can be shared. Using Microsoft Entra users or groups requires you to manually delete users and the group. You are designing an authentication solution for a hybrid environment that spans Azure and on-premises data centers. You need to use Microsoft Entra ID to authenticate remote users accessing applications on premises. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Microsoft Entra Domain Services. Option 2, Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. Option 3, Microsoft Entra Connect. Option 4, Windows Hello for Business. Correct answer, Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. Explanation: application proxy allows on-premises applications to use tokens from Microsoft Entra ID. Windows Hello for Business is used for multi-factor authentication, MFA, on Windows clients. Microsoft Entra Connect is used to sync password hashes. Microsoft Entra DS is a managed Active Directory service in the cloud. An application named App1 must access a stored password when connecting to a service named Service1. You plan to use Azure Key Vault to store the password for Service1. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the password for Service1 is stored securely. Which type of object should you create in Key Vault? Option 1, Certificate. Option 2, Key. Option 3, Secret. Correct answer, Secret. Explanation: in Key Vault, secrets are used to store tokens, passwords, certificates, and API keys. Keys are used to store encryption keys. Certificates are used to store TSL/SSL certificates. You need to design a cost management solution for Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. Minimize the number of Azure subscriptions. Allow the reporting of cost by department. How should you organize the resources for cost management? Option 1, create a management group for each department. Option 2, create a subscription for each department. Option 3, create a tag for each resource. Option 4, create an administrative unit for each department. Correct answer, create a tag for each resource. Explanation: creating a cost center tag for every resource enables the use of as many or as few subscriptions, and tracks cost by resource. Creating a management group or subscription for each department requires at least one subscription per department. Your organization has multiple Microsoft Azure resources spread across different regions. Each team manages its own set of resources. You need to design a solution that allows centralized monitoring while respecting the autonomy of each team over their data. Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Which 3 actions should you take? Option 1, configure data collection rules, DCRs, for data ingestion into a centralized workspace. Option 2, implement a centralized log analytics workspace with role-based access control, RBAC. Option 3, implement multiple log analytics workspaces with separate access controls for each team. Option 4, use Azure Monitor alerts to notify teams of resource issues. Option 5, use Azure Monitor workbooks to create dashboards from different sources. Correct answer, configure data collection rules, DCRs, for data ingestion into a centralized workspace. Implement a centralized log analytics workspace with role-based access control, RBAC. Use Azure Monitor workbooks to create dashboards from different sources. Explanation: to achieve centralized monitoring while respecting team autonomy, configure data collection rules, DCRs, to control data ingestion into a centralized workspace, ensuring only relevant data is collected. Implement a centralized log analytics workspace with role-based access control, RBAC, to provide a unified view of logs and metrics while maintaining data security. Use Azure Monitor workbooks to create interactive dashboards that consolidate data from various sources, offering a comprehensive view of resource performance. Implementing multiple log analytics workspaces with separate access controls leads to fragmented data management. Using Azure Policy to enforce monitoring standards is more about governance than performance monitoring, and using Azure Monitor alerts does not directly contribute to centralized monitoring. Your organization has multiple Microsoft Azure subscriptions and needs to ensure compliance with specific security policies. You need to design a governance strategy that enforces these security policies automatically across all subscriptions. Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Which 2 actions should you perform? Choose 2. Option 1, apply security policies to each subscription individually. Option 2, create a management group and apply security policies at this level. Option 3, use Azure Blueprints to define and apply security policies across all subscriptions. Option 4, use Azure Policy to define and assign security policies to the management group. Correct answer, create a management group and apply security policies at this level. Use Azure Policy to define and assign security policies to the management group. Explanation: creating a management group and applying security policies at this level ensures consistent compliance across all resources under the group. This approach leverages Azure's hierarchical structure for efficient policy enforcement. Using Azure Policy to define and assign security policies to the management group allows for automated compliance enforcement, ensuring that all subscriptions inherit these policies and providing a scalable governance strategy. Using Azure Blueprints to define and apply security policies across all subscriptions is a more automated approach but may not fully utilize the hierarchical benefits of management groups. Applying security policies to each subscription individually is inefficient and error-prone, as it involves manual application and does not offer a scalable solution.